Good day everyone, Grimmels here with another DCS video, and today we take a look at another new module for DCS that was just recently released into early access, the AV-8B Harrier 2 by Razbam, the developer of the Mirage 2000C. And the Harrier is of course a very cool and unique module, being one of the very few jets with the capability to take off and land vertical, and the first fixed-wing plane in DCS with this capability. Now, as with all new modules, I plan on doing multiple videos of the Harrier, starting off with a basic overview and demonstration of its basics capabilities and some vertical takeoff and landings in this one, followed by more in-depth videos later on when I had more time to learn the plane's capabilities better. Well, let's take a look at Razbam's Harrier module. As I said, the Harrier just entered early access, so keep in mind that there might still be a few bugs in it. Now, together with the Harrier, Razbam also released the USS Tarawa Amphibious Assault Ship, which I just took off from. Now, amphibious assault ships are basically small carriers, which mostly carry helicopters as well as landing ships, and they are the ships M9c Harriers would usually operate from if they operate from ships. Also, new is the KC-130 Hercules tanker for airborne refueling. So far the only basket-equipped tanker plane was the Viking, with Air Force planes using boom to refuel rather than a basket. Those are some nice additions for the Harrier, as well as other planes that are in DCS or coming up. The KC-130 for example would also work with the F-18 and F-14, and the Tarawa for all kinds of helicopters or naval ops scenarios. But let's talk about the Harrier itself. Now, the Harrier's development goes back to the 60s. Back then there was a worry among NATO nations that traditional air bases in case of a Cold War breaking out into a full-scale war would be very vulnerable, and to combat this NATO issued a military requirement for VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing, combat aircraft in the 60s. Something some companies including Hawker were already experimenting with at the time. The requirement called for a supersonic fighter and a subsonic strike fighter, as well as a transport plane to supply improvised airfields that were envisioned for those VTOL fighters. Quite a few prototype planes were built by NATO members for this requirement, and one of them for the subsonic strike fighter role was the Hawker Siddeley P1127 Kestrel, which you could already recognize as a predecessor of the Harrier. Now, almost all of those prototypes and projects did not do so great, especially the supersonic jet fighter ones, as the progress was slow on most of them, and a vertical takeoff capability reduced the effectiveness of a jet compared to a standard one. NATO's focus eventually shifted away from the whole VTOL idea, and their requirements were cancelled, and all the prototypes, with one exception, ended there. The one exception, however, the British Hawker Siddeley Kestrel, had shown enough promise that it was decided to further develop their design into a VTOL ground attack aircraft, which would become the original Hawker Siddeley Harrier. Originally with the original idea in mind of having a plane that could be dispersed into the field if the real air bases were under threat. Another use for the plane was that it was very well suited for small carriers, and that is what many export customers of the plane bought it for. The Harrier can greatly increase the firepower of a small carrier that was originally designed only for helicopters. The US Marines bought the original Harrier, and it entered service there in the early 70s as the AV-8A Harrier. A few years later, in an effort to increase the Harrier's capabilities, the AV-8B Harrier 2 was developed, which we are flying here, and the US version built by McDonnell Douglas in the US. The new Harrier had an improved engine and much better avionics compared to the old one, including a stability program to make hover easier. The Harrier 2 also got a newly designed wing with less wing sweep than the older Harrier's wing, as well as large leading edge extensions added to it that increased the maximum angle of attack, which the older Harrier did not have. Though the Harrier always had vortex generators on the wings, similar to the Hawk, which serve a similar role than the leading edge extensions, and the Harrier 2 retained those. Those changes increased the plane's handling at slower speed and increase its payload, while also decreasing its maximum speed a bit compared to the old Harrier. The version we have in DCS, the AV-8B NA stands for Night Attack, was the second version of the Harrier 2, and as the name suggests, was developed to increase the plane's ability to attack at night. In order to do that, the plane has the so-called ABRIS system in the nose, which consists of a laser spot tracker for night attack and the television camera for daylight use. The system is capable of seeing a laser spot if, for example, friendly ground troops or helicopters like Kiowa paint the target with it, and can then give the pilot a targeting solution to attack the target with unguided weapons, not just laser-guided ones, similar to a CCRP drop. In daylight, the camera tracking can be used instead of the laser spot, similar to a targeting bot. On top of that, the Harrier also has a Flir, a forward-looking infrared in the nose above the ABRIS. This Flir, however, unlike many modern Flir systems, deserves the forward-looking name, as it is fixed and can only look forward, not swivel around to track targets like the ABRIS or targeting bot can. The Flir is mostly used for navigation at night, while the ABRIS, in combination with someone painting a target with a laser, would be used to attack. We will take a closer look at all those systems in later videos when I had more time to familiarize myself more with those systems. Now let's talk a little bit about the weapons available to the Harrier 2 in DCS. We have the usual arsenal of unguided weapons for once, the Mark 81 to Mark 83 unguided bombs in many varieties, high and low drag, as well as cluster bombs, Hydra 70mm rockets and 5-inch Zuni rockets. Now the Zunis are similar to the Russian S-13, and I don't think we have another player-controlled plane at the moment that can use them in DCS. All are 5-inch rockets on the Saber, but not the Zuni. The Zuni is a nice addition, as I feel that the smaller Hydra's performance is lacking versus lightly armored vehicles, which I think is one of the most common ground target in DCS. For guided weapons we have the GPU-12 laser-guided bombs and Maverick missiles in almost all their variants. The Harrier can also carry the Lightning targeting bot, which can take over a lot of the ABRIS's capabilities. One reason why the ABRIS was in the later Harrier 2 Plus replaced with a radar which allowed the Harrier 2 Plus to use MRAM missiles. Our Harrier 2 NA does not have a radar and also can't carry the AIM-120 as a result. It can carry up to 4 M9c Sidewinder for air-to-air combat. And of course it's cannon back with a 25mm Gatling cannon, which is a nice amount of firepower. The cannon comes with both air-to-ground and air-to-air modes, but again, the NA does not have a radar, so you won't get a radar-assisted gunsight. And last but not least, the Harrier module brings another new weapon to the table we did not have before for a player-controlled aircraft in DCS, the AGM-122 Sidearm, which is an anti-radiation missile to counter radar-guided SAMs and AAA, for example, based on the Sidewinder C. Now, the M9c Sidewinder was an older radar-guided variant of the Sidewinder, which means instead of a passive infrared seeker, it had a passive radar receiver to guide it towards the target by flying at the radar energy reflected from the target as the launching plane paints it with its radar. Since the missile already was designed for a radar seeker, it was relatively easy to modify them to use a seeker that flew towards a radar emitter like a SAM radar directly instead of reflected radar energy. Somewhat similar to the HOJAM mode on the AIM-7 Sparrow. Now, the Sidewinder is of course a relatively small missile, and therefore the sidearm is also small and less capable than other anti-radiation missiles available, and is more meant for short-range self-defense against radar-guided threats for helicopters, but it can be used in a wild weasel role as well with the DCS Harrier. Again, we will take a closer look at all that in a later video. Now, after having talked a bit about the Harrier's history and its basic capabilities and weapons, let's take a look at what makes this little fighter real special: its ability to take off and land vertically. Now, the core part of the Harrier's ability to do that is the Rolls-Royce Pegasus Engine. Now, the Pegasus is quite a large and heavy engine. I saw one in a museum in Munich. It's quite impressive in size, especially for such a small airframe like the Harrier, which is designed to be a very small and light fighter for obvious reasons. The combination of a large and powerful engine and a small light airframe is what provides the necessary thrust-to-weight ratio to take off vertically. That also means that there isn't much space for ordnance and fuel though, which is why the Harrier can't carry that much weapons and without external fuel tanks has a pretty short range. Especially when it is taking off and landing vertically, which uses quite a bit of fuel because of the high thrust required. Of course the Harrier can carry external fuel tanks to increase its range, but that of course also reduces its already relatively small payload. Good thing we got the KC-130 tanker. The weight restriction when taking off vertically also reduces the effective payload of the plane roughly by half compared to a short rolling takeoff. Well, anyway, in order to put that great thrust-to-weight ratio to use in vertical takeoff, the Pegasus engine is equipped with 4 nozzles that can be swiveled down. The 2 in front use the cold air from the turbofan's bypass, the 2 in the rear are for the hot exhaust. 4 are of course needed to provide balance. The pilot has a lever for the engine nozzle's angle next to the throttle and can freely choose the angle of the nozzles with the lever between 0, which is straight back, and 99 degrees, which is pointing slightly forward. I have the nozzle lever bound to the same slider I use for RPM in World War II fighters. Tilting those nozzles down, the Harrier can hover, and then maneuver in a similar way than a helicopter, however much slower. A Harrier in a hover is nowhere near as maneuverable as a helicopter. In a hover, the traditional control surfaces of course don't work, so in order to be able to control the plane while hovering, the Harrier is equipped with air jets in the wings, nose and tail that use bleed air from the engine to provide reaction control, so you can pitch, roll and yaw. Especially the yaw control, however, is very slow. As I said, the nozzle angle can be set to more than 90 degrees, and that way the nozzle can be used to brake and fly backwards in a hover, similar to the thrusters of the Wigan but in a hover. I found that especially useful when I noticed that I approached my landing site too fast. Putting the nozzle at full 99 degrees slows you down pretty quick. And I so far used the nozzle angle a lot to control speed in a hover in general. Coordinating the nozzle angle and thrust can be a bit tricky at first, but I feel something that one can learn quickly enough if you do it often enough. And yes, theoretically you could use that during a dogfight to slow down faster and force an overshoot of an opponent behind you. How useful that would really be can be debated, however, as it leaves you at slow speed and low energy level. I am generally not a fan of maneuvers that intentionally kill your energy in an air-to-air fight. The nozzles could however also be used to increase your turning circle, something I have to try out more, though till I can say more about it. Now, another thing to keep in mind in VTOL operations is the plane's water injection. In order to provide extra thrust during takeoff and landing with a heavier load, the Pegasus is equipped with a water injection system. The water injection cools the engine and also provides extra thrust. Water has more mass than air, so having the extra mass of the water shooting out the nozzle together with the air at high speed increases the kinetic energy of that reaction mass that is coming out of the jet nozzle, and therefore the thrust the engine produces. On the downside, the large water tank of the Harrier is used up very quickly as the water is injected into the engine at a very high rate. Something to keep in mind. I already had one crash because I forgot to turn the water injection off after takeoff in time and used up much of the water, and when I then needed it when I was landing with a heavy load and my descent rate accidentally got too high and I tried to stop it using the full power of the engine with the water injection, I ran out of water. The water injection has 2 modes: takeoff, in which the water injection turns on when the throttle is high enough and stays on till you either manually turn it off or you throttle back. Once it is off after throttling back, it does not come back on automatically after throttling back up. In landing mode it is almost the same, but it turns on every time you throttle up to high enough power level. With your ordnance depleted and fuel lower after a mission, you usually don't need the water injection to land, but when you land with a higher weight or you need to arrest a higher descent rate quickly, it is sometimes needed. Heat is already a problem for the Harrier during vertical takeoff and landing, with especially the rear nozzles getting very hot, so a normal afterburner would not work for it. Well now, as I said, the Harrier only just came out, so I don't have that much experience with it yet, and I have less than 10 vertical landings as of the making of this video. But my verdict on the VTOL operation so far is that the vertical takeoff is pretty easy. Just tilt the nozzles down, not too far though, or you go backwards, and you jump straight in the air as you throttle up. Now just slowly decrease the angle of the nozzles and speed up. The Harrier 2 stability system is keeping it nice and stable during takeoff. I think the older Harrier would have been more difficult to take off. Now, landing and hovering is a bit more tricky. Similar to a helicopter, the most difficult thing is getting the plane into a true hover without slowly going forward or backwards. But also like with a helicopter, I guess it's only a matter of time and some training, I would imagine, till you build up the necessary muscle memory to automatically combine the nozzle lever, thrust lever and the pitch and roll angle to keep the plane in a true hover. Overall, while it is tricky, I feel it is less difficult than I feared it might be. Well, and that is a basic first look at Razbam's Harrier. Quite a nice modules and cool to get something really new with the plane's VTOL ability in DCS. I will take a closer look at the Harrier system and weapons once I had time to learn them. Till then, this is it for this video. I hope it was informative. Thanks for watching.